Hey everybody, it's Bina 007 here for episode 50 of Vassals of Kingsgrave's Agatha Christie linear reread. And today it's another minipod covering Ordeal by Innocence, originally published in November 1958 when Agatha Christie was in her late 60s. This is the novel that comes after the Miss Marple murder mystery 450 from Paddington and comes before the Hercule Poirot mystery Cat Among the Pigeons. And in this novel, there is no title name detective. Is it a puzzle mystery? I think it's more of a character study and something to solve, but something to understand about human nature and about the nature of evil and crime and punishment. So the setup of this novel is similar to books like Five Little Pigs or Sad Cypress, where you're looking back at a crime that was committed in the past and trying to figure out if the person who's accused was actually the one who did it. The novel begins with a geologist called Arthur Calgary who has been away on an expedition in the Arctic, so sort of completely cut off from any news of any kind. He returns and just happens upon some newspaper packing sheets. And this is a little bit, I suppose, like Mrs. McGinty's Dead, where you see something in newspaper that is used for packing, and realizes that a hitchhiker that he gave a lift to just before he went on his expedition, was accused of murdering his own mother. And although he wasn't swung for it, he did die in prison. And the reason why he died is because he said he had an alibi. The police looked hither and thither for the person who could confirm this, but of course Arthur Calgary was abroad and away from all news sources. So he feels a great personal responsibility to the man, Jacko Argyle, who died in prison, and indeed to his family, because he feels that they are living under the false impression that this person murdered the mother. So on his return, he goes to their family home called Sunny Point. This is 2 years now after the mother, Rachel Argyle, was murdered. And he gives them the news that their son, Jacko, did not do it. And he thinks they're going to be so happy because now they know he's innocent. But of course they're not, because they have remade their lives. Rachel Argyle's widow is on the verge of marrying again. The children have all moved on. And of course, if Jacko didn't do it, who did? The suspicion then falls on the people who are part of the household. So it opens up a proverbial can of worms, and the people who kind of follow it through to its conclusion are Arthur Calgary, but also one of the son-in-laws of the family who decides to take it upon himself to investigate. This is, I think, a very well-regarded novel, or certainly one of the better regarded of the later Agatha Christie novels. For me, I think it has an amazing tone and it's an interesting character study. But I do find the solution ultimately flawed. I mean, not in an extravagant way like with Murder in Mesopotamia, but still it doesn't quite feel credible to me. I'll get into that in the final section of this podcast after the end credits music, where we discuss the solution and clues. As ever, until then, this will be spoiler free. Perhaps unsurprisingly for such a claustrophobic family-focused novel, there isn't that much social change to document, certainly in comparison to, I'm thinking in particular actually of a slightly later novel that's going to come up in the early 60s, The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side, which is almost entirely worth reading for all the social change it documents. The only thing I could spot was the idea that church graveyards have now been superseded by municipal cemeteries. Here's a quotation. Tina parked her car on the grass by the churchyard wall. She removed the paper carefully from the flowers she had brought. Then she walked in through the cemetery gates and along the main path. She did not like the new cemetery. She wished it had been possible for Mrs. Argyle to have been buried in the old churchyard which surrounded the church. There seemed an old-world peace there, the yew tree and the moss-grown stones. In this cemetery, so new, so well arranged, with its main walk and the paths radiating off it, everything seemed as slick and mass-produced as the contents of a supermarket. Another concept we're going to hear about in The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side. So yes, social change. We're in the world of well-planned suburbs. And actually, Sunny Point, unlike many of the houses containing unhappy families in Agatha Christie, is not an old country house. It's actually a newly built and also newly renamed house. Okay, so let's see what our readers would have had as context when they received their Christie for Christmas in 1958. What happened between the publication of the 450 from Paddington in November 57 and the publication of this book? Well, in January 1958, the European Economic Community, the forerunner of the European Union, came into being. In February 1958, 7 Manchester United footballers were among the 21 people killed in the infamous Munich air disaster in West Germany on the return flight from a European Cup game in Yugoslavia. In March 1958, Nikita Khrushchev became premier of the Soviet Union. In May 1958, French Algerian protesters seized government offices in Algiers, leading to a military coup. In June 1958, Charles de Gaulle was brought out of retirement to lead France by decree for 6 months. So, this Algerian crisis is causing a real political crisis in the heart of France. In July 1958, we have revolution in Iraq. King Faisal II and several family members are executed. Abd al-Karim Qasim assumes power. And actually, I wonder if that influenced the prologue plot in Cat Among the Pigeons, the next novel that Agatha Christie will publish. Also in July 1958, the US Congress formally creates NASA. And more close to home, and rather sadly, on the August bank holiday in 1958, in London, we see the Notting Hill race riots. So we're seeing the increased racial tensions as we have the waves of immigration now coming to London from the West Indies in particular. In September 1958, Bank Americard, the first credit card to be widely offered, is launched in Fresno, California, in what becomes known as the Fresno Drop, so the start of widespread consumer credit. And in September 1958, in the 1958 French constitutional referendum, a majority of 79% say yes to the constitution of the Fifth Republic. Finally, in October 1958, the British Overseas Airways Corporation, so the predecessor of British Airways, uses the new de Havilland Comet jets to become the first airline to fly jet passenger services across the Atlantic. How ridiculously exciting. So it's a time of decolonisation, of racial unrest, of revolution, and technological advances. Okay, so let's get into the characters of this novel and start with Rachel Argyle, who has been murdered 2 years before the novel opens, so we only know her through other people's reminiscences of her. She is, we're taken to understand, independently wealthy and desperately wanted to be a mother. She married Leo Argyle, an academic economist and an Oxford Don, but she could not have children. The great tragedy of her life, something that's going to be echoed in the mirror crack from side to side. So she turns to adoption and she adopts 5 children. She started off doing this because in the war, children were being evacuated from London. And so she sets up a home for some of them at Sunny Point, and she even brings in various members of staff to help her, some of whom stay on after the war. And she adopts these 5 children, and we understand that they all come from rather difficult socio-economically deprived backgrounds. And to all intents and purposes, she's a doting mother. She provides for them financially. But like many of the parents, adoptive or otherwise, in Agatha Christie, she's also very possessive and tries to sort of control what they do in their careers and who they see and who they don't see. And I think Agatha Christie has a very jaundiced view of adoption and sees this as a kind of fake or play acting maternal love and one that isn't genuine. And I'll get into that in the progressive regressive part of this book. So, of her 5 children, the eldest is Mary Argyle. She's now in her late 20s. They adopted her when they were in New York City before World War II, and she has gone on to marry Philip Durrant. And Philip is a former pilot in World War II, but before the novel opens, he's contracted polio and paralyzed his legs, which will be similar to a character that appears in the Pale Horse. Here's a quotation. Mary Durrant crossed the room and picked up some fallen petals from a vase of chrysanthemums. She put them carefully into the wastepaper basket. She was a tall, serene-looking young woman of 27, who, although her face was unlined, yet looked older than her years, probably from a sedate maturity that seemed part of her makeup. She had good looks, without a trace of glamour. Regular features, a good skin, eyes of a vivid blue, and fair hair combed off her face and arranged in a large bun at the back of the neck. a style which at that moment happened to be fashionable, although that was not her reason for wearing it so. She was a woman who always kept to her own style. Her appearance was like her house, neat, well kept. Any kind of dust or disorder worried her. And we're taken to understand that it's not a hugely happy marriage. Philip Durrant, although now paralysed, feels that he's being infantilized and condescended to by his wife, and that she's very controlling. She gives slight misery vibes to me. So that's Mary Argyle and husband Philip. We then come to the son, Michael, or Mickey Argyle. He is incredibly angry at life. He's incredibly angry that his birth mother from the East End did not come to find him after the war ended. He works as a car salesman in the nearby town, but his mum wanted him to go into the oil business in the Middle East. The next son is Jacko Argyle, so the one who was accused of Rachel's murder. And I think we're meant to understand that he is very self-centered, that he's a wrong 'un, basically. He already had a police record when they arrested him, and that he's very self-interested and very menacing, and that he was in debt. He needed money. And when Rachel, who was very wealthy, refused to give it to him, that he coshed her over the head for it and stole it. Next comes Hester Argyle, who is about 20 when the novel opens. She seems to be a rather weak-willed character. She describes herself as fluid, and I think that's correct. She's sort of drifting through life without finding her place in it. We're going to discover that she's a failed actress, so for those of us who read Agatha Christie, that sets off an immediate alarm. She has very high amplitude emotions, so a very mini type of the Marina Gregg character in The Mirror Cracked. I think is rather vulnerable and rather ripe to be exploited. And actually, we'll discover that Philip Durrant has a bit of a thing for her. So she very much is one of those frail but pretty women who's probably going to go through life being exploited, maybe a little bit actually, like the character in Evil Under the Sun. And then we have Christina or Tina Argyle. She came to the family when she was very little. She works at the library in the nearby town and has a very calm, very sort of superficially cool personality. The interesting point about Tina in the novel, and it's sad that she's reduced to this, is that she is of mixed race, ethnicity, and again, we will get into this when we get to the progressive regressive part of this novel. So those are the 5 children, and then let's get into the other people who were around and about the house. So first of all, there's Kirsten Lindstrom, who is a Swedish nurse and was employed by Rachel when the home was housing children during the war and has stayed on as a housekeeper. She's obviously very close to the children and has provided them an element of maternal love in addition to the sort of financial comforts that Rachel is providing. Then there's Gwenda Vaughan, who is secretary to the widower, Leo Argyle. And I think that, this is part of the trope that Agatha Christie has, that all secretaries must obviously be in love with their employers. And poor Leo and Gwenda were about to announce their engagement when Arthur Calgary turns up and throws the cat among the pigeons, which could have been a title for this book, actually. I kind of feel sorry for them. I mean, Gwenda Vaughan is in her mid to late 30s. This is probably, in her mind, her chance at happiness. And it feels, she doesn't look like a sort of money-grubbing young hussy. She looks like a woman who's very sensible and lovely. And they probably would make a good couple. But sadly, I think when Arthur Calgary turns up, Leo's reaction is, well, we can't get married now because people will think that was my motive for killing my wife. So it's really tragic that the wedding gets put on hold. We have a couple of other characters. We've got Superintendent Hewish, who was the police officer who handled the first investigation. We've got Dr. McMaster, who is a retired local doctor who saw the children in the Sunny Point house and gives information on their backdrop. What I find fascinating about Dr. McMaster is that when we meet him, he's really kicking against being retired. And I do wonder if this is how Agatha Christie feels. I mean, bear in mind, she's now in her late 60s, still churning out novels, way wealthy, so she doesn't have to for the money. And maybe she lives in fear of retirement. This is how Dr. McMaster describes it. Quote, I'm bored to death since I retired from practice. Young men of my own profession tell me I must sit here like a dummy taking care of my groggy heart. But don't think it comes natural to me. It doesn't. I listen to the wireless, blah, 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 and occasionally my housekeeper persuades me to look at the television, flick, flick, flick. I've been a busy man, run off my feet all my life. I don't take kindly to sitting still. End quote. Reminds me a bit of Miss Marple there. We also have Mr. Andrew Marshall, who was the attorney for the Argyle family and defended Jacko at his trial, not very successfully, evidently. We have Donald Craig, who's a young doctor in town who's dating Hester Argyle. Okay, so what happens in this novel is basically that Arthur Calgary and indeed the son-in-law Philip Durrant start investigating what really happened, what the alibis were, and try to come up with a solution. There are some late in the stage murders as well. This is quite a bloodthirsty, nasty sort of a book. I find sometimes with these small, claustrophobic, enclosed family books, such as A Pocket Full of Rye, they really are by far the nastiest in terms of tone. As I've alluded to before, there are some issues with the tone of this novel for modern readers. We have a guy who's in a wheelchair and lots of reference to him as being crippled or cripples, which today we wouldn't maybe use that language. There is lots of stuff that's really unpalatable to read about mixed race people and about the idea that Tina's father was a Southeast Asian merchant sailor, and they use the L word, Lascar, to describe him, which I think now, I'm not sure if that would be okay, but I certainly wouldn't use it. I find it pejorative. And there's heredity stuff going all the way through this, not just for Tina, but especially for her. The idea that Tina's a dark horse and that the part of her that could be seen as suspicious as the dark part. Oh, it's just really unpleasant. But here are some passages on heredity and adoption which I found really troubling. Quote, "Yes, Leo thought, surely it was a worthwhile job to take these children, to give them the benefits of a home and the love of a father and mother. Rachel, he thought, had had the right to be triumphant. Only it hadn't worked out quite the way it was supposed to. For these children were not the children that he and Rachel would have had. Within them ran none of the blood of Rachel's hard-working, thrifty forebears, none of the drive and ambition by which the less reputable members of her family had gained their assured places in society, none of the vague kindliness and integrity of mind that he remembered in his own father and grandmother, none of the intellectual brilliance of his grandparents on the other side. Everything that environment could do was done for them. It could do a great deal, but it could not do everything. There had been those seeds of weakness which had brought them to the nursery in the first place, and under stress those seeds might bear flower. That was exemplified very fully in Jacko. Jacko, the charming, agile Jacko, with his merry quips, his charm, his easy habit of twisting everyone round his finger, was essentially of a delinquent type. It showed very early in childish thieving, in lies, all things that were put down to his original bad upbringing. Things that could be, Rachel said, easily ironed out, but they never did get ironed out. End quote. And here's Leo once again. It was an article of faith with her that the blood tie didn't matter, but the blood tie does matter, you know. There is usually something in one's own children, some kink of temperament, some way of feeling that you recognize and can understand without having to put into words. You haven't got that tie with children you adopt. One has no instinctive knowledge of what goes on in their minds. You judge them, of course, by yourself, by your own thoughts and feelings, but it's wise to recognize that those thoughts and feelings may be very widely divergent from theirs. End quote. So, of course, this is Leo Argyle. It's not necessarily Agatha Christie, but this comes up time and again around the issue of adoption. And I know that she felt through her mother that adoption was cruel, that even in the worst of socioeconomic circumstances, it was better for the child to stay with a mother. But I find these notions of hereditary, that you're just born bad from bad genetics because you came from poor parents or parents who were in bad circumstances, and that, good education and love cannot iron those out. Very, very regressive indeed, and really uncomfortable to read for a modern reader. So be warned. I would almost go so far as to say that if you have adoption in your family, as I do, that this isn't a book you should read because you might find it really quite off-putting. And, if like me, you're a person of colour, a line like, "Tina's always the dark horse, perhaps it's the half of her that isn't white," end quote, is not going to make for comfortable reading either. I know we can litigate whether this is the characters or whether it's Agatha, but at any rate, as a social document of 1958 in the UK, at a time of race riots in the Notting Hill area of London, in a best-selling novel of its time, then I think we can argue that this probably does fairly reflect the environment in which people of colour were living in England at that time, and that makes me sad. Okay, so before we get into the solution and the end credits section, let's get into adaptations. So there are actually 3 of this novel, and unfortunately I didn't see the first one because it sounds really fun, but I couldn't find it on any of the UK streaming services. It's a film adaptation made in 1985, directed by Desmond Davis, starring Donald Sutherland as Arthur Calgary, Sarah Miles as Mary Durrant, Christopher Plummer as Leo Argyle, Ian McShane, our very own Deadwood hero, as Philip Durrant, Diana Quick as Gwen Vaughan, and Faye Dunaway as Rachel Argyle. I mean, what an absolutely amazing cast. It also has a really hilariously inappropriate score by Dave Brubeck, the jazz musician. I'd love to see this actually, but I haven't managed to get my hands on it. If you have watched it, feel free to discuss it on the Discord at Vassals of Kingsgrave or leave a comment on the YouTube channel. There are two adaptations that I did see. The first is the ITV Agatha Christie's Marple series, starring Geraldine McEwen. So they shoehorned Miss Marple into this in 2007. And how they did it is they made Miss Marple a friend of Gwen Vaughan, played by the wonderful Juliet Stevenson. And actually, this has got a great cast. It's got Dennis Lawson as Leo. It's got the singer Lisa Stansfield as Mary Durrant. Jane Seymour plays Rachel. You've got a very young Bern Gorman as Jacko. So it's just a really all-round superb cast. I actually think this is a really lovely version of the novel. I think it's very sympathetic. There are some changes, in particular to who gets murdered, but the plot resolution is faithful to the book. So yeah, it's a really great cast, and I think it's worth watching. It's different, but it's still, I think, kind of faithful to the broad strokes of the book, and a really good watch. The most recent adaptation is from the BBC, and it's one of the Sarah Phelps adaptations. It really plays fast and loose with everything, the motivation, who did the murder, the means of the murder. So I don't think it's worth watching if you want to have a vision of Ordeal by Innocence. It's got a good cast though. It's got Bill Nighy as Leo Argyle, Anna Chancellor as Rachel Argyle, Matthew Good actually really laughing it up as Philip Durrant, and Alice Eve as a very young Gwen Vaughan who's playing a bit of a sexpot. So yeah, it's just very, very different and published in 2018. I just think it's really not worth watching insofar as it's not Ordeal by Innocence. Would it stand up on its own merits? I'm not sure it would actually, because I think the motivation that Sarah Phelps substitutes for Agatha Christie's is just way more hokey and guessable and silly. So yeah, I would say, I mean, for those reasons, weirdly, the Miss Marple adaptation is probably the better one. Anyway, it's a very troubling, strange, interesting novel. I know it is fairly popular, and Agatha Christie, although she did change this, called it one of her favourites. I find it troubling. I find the solution difficult, and I find a lot. I'm normally not too concerned about a lot of the regressive stuff because I think it just socially documents what was happening at the time. But this one, with its attitudes towards heredity and adoption and race, I did find a very difficult read. But anyway, if you have read it, I'd love to hear what you think. And stay tuned for the next episode where we'll discuss Cat Among the Pigeons from November 1959. Thank you for listening. Okay, folks, so we're back for the solution to this novel, and the solution is as follows. Jacko really was a wrong'un, and he needs money. His mother wouldn't give it to him, so he managed to get Kirsten, the Swedish nursemaid turned housekeeper, to kosh her instead. And he told her that she had to do it within a certain time so that he could establish his alibi by hitchhiking. This is the conversation that Tina overhears, the conversation about doing it within a certain time. So we're given to understand that Jacko has got a long track record of seducing older women and nicking their money. So we're meant to think that Kirsten is just the latest line of women that he seduced. But unfortunately for Jacko, after Kirsten's committed the murder, Jacko's wife turns up. And at that point, Kirsten believes that she's been betrayed by him. And that's why she always speaks very disparagingly of him and calls him wicked. She kills Philip because he's going to confront Tina with a theory about the murder. So when people see her going into his office with a cup of coffee, she's actually coming out, having stabbed him. And then she stabs Tina in very short order. So when Tina says the cup was empty, what she's trying to indicate is, the woman was coming out of the office like this. She can't have been delivering coffee. I have a great many issues with the way in which this all resolves. For a start, when Jacko, who we're led to believe is incredibly selfish, realizes he's going to get hung for this murder, why doesn't he say no, it was Kirsten who did it? Why doesn't he throw her under the bus? My second problem with the solution is that I get that Jacko could seduce all these elderly women who don't know him and don't perceive him as a child, like someone they raised. But would that seduction really work with Kirsten? Wouldn't it have been better to sort of manipulate her into thinking that she was his real mum, like the real mother figure? Do it for me because you're the only one who can really protect me, as opposed to a romantic love. So I find that a little bit weak too. But I guess in a way you can also detect this just by your knowledge of prior Agatha Christie novels, because there's a fair few, aren't there, where you set up a very unhappy family dynamic with a domineering mother or father who's killed, and you're looking for the suspects within the family. In fact, you've been presented with one in Jacko. But actually, the murderer is living with a family but outside the family. So examples of that would be Appointment with Death, Hercule Poirot's Christmas, and indeed the 450 from Paddington that we've just read. So maybe Agatha Christie sort of working out an idea twice with novels that are published very soon, one after the other. But I have to say that for this, I do find the idea that he would manipulate, not that he would manipulate Kirsten, because we're meant to see he's charismatic and manipulative, but that he would do it through romantic rather than quasi-maternal love odd. And I find it weird that he would not implicate her, or indeed that if she was that hurt, that she wouldn't somehow let slip of what he did to her, because he has already served time, right? So I find the whole thing ever so slightly unsatisfactory at the end. So not one of my favourite novels, but we move on, we voyage joyfully. Next up will be Cats Among the Pigeons, and I hope you'll join me then. Thank you very much for listening.